She thought she was walking into a courthouse. She had no idea she was walking into a test. The garage beneath the Fulton County Courthouse felt colder than the morning above it, the kind of cold that clung to concrete, steel, and silence. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in long, pale strips, throwing a harsh glow across parked SUVs, painted pillars, and oil stains that looked older than the building itself. Naomi Brooks stepped out of the elevator with a leather case tucked close to her side, her heels clicking softly against the cement as she moved with calm, measured purpose. She wore a charcoal coat over a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing loud, just clean lines and quiet confidence. In another setting, most people might have passed her without a second glance. But places built on power had a way of exposing people for who they really were. Halfway to the security door, Naomi heard a car door slam hard enough to echo. Then another. A white couple in expensive coats stepped into the lane between the columns, their voices already sharp, already irritated, as if the world had failed them before breakfast. The man, tall and broad, with the kind of red-faced impatience that made everyone else feel smaller, stopped when he saw her. His wife followed his stare, lips tightening as her eyes moved over Naomi's coat, her face, the case in her hand. It happened fast, the way these things often did. Not because truth moves quickly, but because prejudice doesn't need time to think. "Excuse me," the man said, but there was no courtesy in it. He didn't sound like someone making room. He sounded like someone claiming it. Naomi slowed, not out of fear, but because she had learned long ago that some moments announce themselves before they arrive. "You can't just wander around down here," the woman added, folding her arms as if she belonged to the building more than anyone else inside it. "This area connects to the court entrance." Naomi looked at her for a moment, steady and unreadable. "I'm aware," she said, her voice calm, low, and clear. That should have ended it. For decent people, it would have. But the husband took a step closer, his shoes scraping over the concrete. "Then you should also be aware this isn't public access for anyone looking lost." Naomi's grip shifted slightly. On the leather case. Not defensive. Controlled. Her expression didn't change, but something in the air did. Around them, the garage remained almost still except for the distant hum of an idling engine and the faint rattle of pipes somewhere overhead. Even silence felt like it was listening now. The woman gave Naomi a thin smile, the kind that never reached the eyes. "Honestly, people walk in here acting like they belong anywhere these days." The words hung there, ugly in their simplicity, polished just enough to pretend they meant less than they did. Naomi said nothing. She did not lower her gaze. She did not explain herself. She simply stood there beneath the flickering light, shoulders straight, face composed, as if she understood something they did not. And that was what unsettled them most. Because some people can tolerate confidence until it wears the wrong skin. The man's jaw tightened. "Let me make this easy," he said. "Why don't you tell us who you're here with before security does it for you?" Naomi glanced once toward the locked door ahead, then back at the couple blocking her path. Her voice, when it came, was almost too even, too steady for the tension gathering around them. "You should be very careful what kind of assumptions you make in a courthouse." For a second, neither of them moved. Then the woman let out a short, mocking laugh. She thought she was speaking to a stranger in a parking garage. Minutes later, she would realize she had been speaking to the woman who would look down from the bench and decide exactly how much that moment would cost. Naomi did not wait for their approval, and she certainly did not ask for it. She adjusted the leather case against her side and stepped forward with the kind of composure that made lesser people uneasy, because calm in the face of disrespect always feels like a threat to those who mistake arrogance for authority. The man moved first, not with force, but with the entitled confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime believing public spaces bent around his mood. He shifted just enough to narrow the path, his wife beside him like an echo of the same prejudice dressed in better tailoring. "I do not think you heard us," she said, her voice clipped and cool. "This entrance is for court personnel, attorneys, and approved parties." Naomi stopped again, not because she had to, but because the moment had reached that familiar line where explanation would no longer be about clarity. It would be about permission, and she had long ago decided she would never ask to stand where she had already earned the right to be. Above them, one of the fluorescent tubes flickered twice, casting light across the concrete in pale, uneven flashes. Somewhere deeper in the garage, a car alarm chirped and fell silent. The courthouse was waking up overhead, but down here the air still belonged to shadows, assumptions, and the kind of judgment that always arrived before facts did. Naomi let her eyes settle on the woman first, then the husband, her expression measured, almost patient. "I know exactly where this entrance leads," she said. The husband gave a dry laugh, the sound bouncing off the cement walls with more confidence than intelligence. "That is funny," he said, "because from where I am standing, you look very confused." His wife smiled at that, pleased in the small, ugly way people often are when cruelty lands the way they hoped it would. Naomi noticed details because she always did. The husband wore a silver courthouse visitor sticker crooked on his lapel. The wife held a slim folder stamped with a law office logo from Buckhead. They were not staff. They were not power. They were proximity to it, which for some people is enough to become dangerous. Naomi's gaze dropped briefly to the folder, then returned to the woman's face. "You should not confuse access with ownership," she said quietly. For the first time, the wife's smile slipped. Only slightly, but enough. There was something in Naomi's tone that refused to play the role they had assigned her. It was not loud. It was not angry. It was simply final, and that unsettled them more than any protest could have. The husband stepped in closer again, lowering his voice as if intimacy could disguise contempt. "You people always show up with attitude when a simple question would do." There it was. No mask now. No polished phrasing. Just the old poison, stripped of ceremony. Naomi felt the words land, not because they were new, but because they were not. Because this country had built entire hallways out of moments exactly like this, where people who had done nothing wrong were asked to defend their presence before they were allowed their dignity. She could have corrected him. She could have reached into her case, shown credentials, ended the exchange in 3 seconds flat. But there was a discipline in restraint, and Naomi Brooks had built her life on knowing when silence could reveal more than argument ever would. At the far end of the row, a side door opened, and a uniformed court security officer stepped into the garage carrying a paper cup of coffee. He was young, maybe early 30s, with a pressed uniform and the tired eyes of someone already behind on a long day. He slowed when he saw them, taking in the standoff with one sweep of his gaze. For a moment, Naomi thought he might do the decent thing. Instead, his eyes went first to the white couple, then to her. That was how it always started. Not with action, with alignment. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. The wife answered before Naomi could speak. "Yes," she said quickly. "This woman is trying to come through the restricted court entrance, and when we asked who she was with, she got defensive." The officer looked at Naomi now, his expression flattening into official caution. "Ma'am, do you have identification on you?" Naomi studied him for a long second, then lifted her chin just slightly. "Yes," she said. "I do." But she did not reach for it. Not yet. The officer kept one hand around his coffee cup and the other resting near his belt, not threatening, not kind, just settled into the posture of a man who believed procedure could excuse instinct. His eyes lingered on Naomi's face a second too long, searching for the kind of uncertainty he expected to find in someone being questioned. But Naomi gave him none. She stood beneath the hard fluorescent glow with her shoulders square and her leather case held close, her expression calm in a way that made everyone around her look slightly less sure of themselves. The husband noticed it too, and people like him never liked calm unless it came from someone they recognized as equal. "Well," he said, glancing from Naomi to the officer, "are we just going to let anybody walk into a courthouse now?" The wife exhaled softly through her nose, as if the inconvenience of Naomi's presence had already ruined her morning. "We were only trying to protect the building," she added, smoothing the edge of her folder with careful fingers. "You never know these days." Naomi had heard that phrase before. It was one of those convenient American expressions that could carry anything inside it: fear, suspicion, entitlement, or plain old racism dressed up as caution. You never know these days. As if dignity itself had become suspicious. As if black skin in a professional space needed to explain itself before it could breathe. The officer shifted his stance and looked back at Naomi. "Ma'am, I am going to need to see some identification before you proceed." His tone was measured, but there was a difference between neutrality and fairness, and Naomi knew it the way some people know bad weather in their bones. He had not asked the couple for identification. He had not questioned why they were standing in a staff corridor garage acting like unofficial gatekeepers. He had simply accepted their version first and moved outward from there. That was how bias worked when it wanted to look respectable. Naomi let a beat pass. Then another. In the quiet, the hum of the lights above seemed louder, and from the ramp beyond the pillars came the distant sound of tires easing over concrete. The courthouse was filling up. Clerks, lawyers, deputies, reporters. The whole machinery of justice beginning its daily ritual, one floor above a moment that would have meant nothing to the wrong witnesses. "You are asking for identification," Naomi said at last, her voice even. "Because they pointed at me." The officer's jaw tightened slightly, uncomfortable now that the logic had been spoken aloud. "I am asking because there appears to be a question about access." Naomi gave a small nod, almost as if she were helping him finish a thought he did not want to complete. "And there was no question about theirs." The wife bristled. "That is ridiculous." Naomi turned her eyes toward her with such composed stillness that the woman's voice seemed to lose shape in the air. "Is it?" she asked. No one answered right away. The husband scoffed, but it came out thinner than before. "Some truths do that. They do not shout. They simply stand in the middle of the room until everyone else starts hearing their own voice differently." Then footsteps echoed from the elevator bay. Quick, purposeful, familiar. A young court clerk rounded the corner carrying a stack of case files against her chest. She was in her late 20s, hair pinned back, reading glasses slipping low on her nose as she hurried toward the security door. She almost passed the scene without looking up. Then she did, and stopped. Her face changed instantly. Not with surprise exactly, but with the sharp recognition of someone who suddenly understands they have walked into the wrong side of a very important moment. Her eyes went first to Naomi, then to the officer, then to the couple. "Your Honor," she said before she could stop herself, the words ringing clean through the garage like a bell struck in cold air. And just like that, the morning turned. For one suspended second, no one moved. The words hung in the garage with a weight that seemed heavier than the concrete itself. "Your Honor." Not ma'am. Not lady. Not this woman. "Your Honor." The young clerk froze with her files pressed against her chest, her eyes wide behind slipping glasses as if she wished she could pull the words back into her mouth. But truth had already done what truth does best. It had entered the room and rearranged it. The husband's face lost color first, then the wife's. It was subtle, almost graceful in its cruelty, the way certainty drained out of them without a sound. A moment ago they had stood there with the smug confidence of people who believed the world would always confirm their assumptions. Now they looked like strangers to their own voices. The security officer straightened so quickly he nearly spilled his coffee. His hand dropped from his belt, then his shoulders shifted, then his whole expression collapsed into the embarrassed stiffness of a man replaying every second of the last minute and realizing none of it had gone the way it should have. Naomi did not rescue any of them from that realization. She simply turned toward the clerk, her composure as unshaken as ever. "Good morning, Miss Parker," she said. The clerk swallowed hard. "Good morning, Judge Brooks." This time there was no hesitation in it. Just clear, professional respect, spoken aloud where everyone could hear. The wife opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Judge." The word came out thin, almost disbelieving, as if the title itself had somehow wronged her. By belonging to the woman she had just tried to diminish. Naomi looked at her, and there was nothing dramatic in her face, nothing triumphant, just the stillness of someone who had long since learned not to confuse power with performance. "Yes," she said. That single word seemed to echo longer than it should have. The husband glanced at the officer as if searching for a way back into the story he had built, some loophole where this could still be somebody else's misunderstanding. "Well," he said, forcing a brittle laugh. Nobody said anything. It was a pathetic sentence, the kind people reach for when they know they have been seen clearly and have nothing left but excuses. Naomi's eyes held on him for one quiet beat. "You did not ask," she replied. Ms. Parker lowered her files slightly, her gaze flicking between the couple and the security officer, then back to Naomi. The officer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I apologize. I did not realize." Naomi turned to him now, and somehow that was worse than anger would have been. Her voice stayed level, but there was steel beneath it, The kind forged not in one morning, but over years of being underestimated by people who called it caution when they meant bias. That is exactly the problem, she said. No one answered. Above them, the muffled movement of the courthouse carried on. Footsteps, elevators, distant voices, the ordinary machinery of the legal system beginning another day. But down here in the garage, the air had changed. The wife clutched her folder tighter against her side. The husband shifted his weight and looked anywhere but at Naomi. They had not expected consequence to arrive dressed in restraint. They had expected outrage, maybe embarrassment, maybe an argument they could dismiss later over lunch. What they got instead was far more unsettling. They got a witness with authority. Ms. Parker stepped toward the security door and pulled it open at once. "They are ready upstairs, Your Honor," she said softly. Naomi gave a slight nod and started forward. As she passed the officer, he stepped aside so quickly it was almost clumsy. As she passed the couple, neither of them spoke. They had discovered, too late, that the woman they treated like she did not belong was the very one the whole courtroom would rise for in less than 5 minutes. The walk from the garage to the courtroom was less than 200 feet, but for Ethan and Vanessa Cole it felt longer than the whole morning that had come before it. Naomi Brooks moved ahead of them with the same measured pace she had carried in the garage, neither hurried nor theatrical, her leather case resting neatly against her side as Ms. Parker held the interior door and fell in a step beside her. The hallway beyond was warmer than the parking level, washed in the yellow-white light of government fixtures and lined with framed portraits of former judges whose eyes seemed to follow every passerby with old institutional patience. Court deputies moved through the corridor with clipboards and radios. Attorneys in dark suits murmured over calendars and motions. A reporter near the elevators checked her phone, then straightened when she saw Naomi pass. Respect moved through the hallway in small gestures, a nod here, a door open there, a clerk stepping back without being asked. It was the kind of quiet recognition that could not be faked, and with every step the couple felt the full weight of what they had done pressing harder against their lungs. Vanessa tried once to recover some version of dignity. "We did not know," she said, her voice low and brittle as she walked several feet behind Naomi. Naomi did not stop. "No," she answered, still facing forward. "You did not." There was nothing cruel in the response, which somehow made it harder to bear. Ethan kept adjusting his tie, as if a straighter knot could fix the way his face had gone tight with shame. He was a man used to talking his way out of discomfort, used to filling silence before it exposed him. But the courthouse had become a different place since the clerk spoke those 2 words in the garage. Now every polished floor seemed to reflect his own smallness back at him. They passed a deputy posted outside courtroom 4C, a broad-shouldered woman with silver at her temples and 30 years of discipline in the way she stood. The moment she saw Naomi, her expression softened into formal respect. "Good morning, Your Honor." Naomi gave a small nod. "Good morning, Deputy Ruiz." Then Deputy Ruiz's eyes shifted to the couple following behind, and in that brief glance there was no open accusation, no drama, just the unmistakable awareness that she was seeing a story without needing it explained. Vanessa looked away first. Ms. Parker leaned in slightly toward Naomi as they approached the courtroom doors. "The hearing packet is on the bench, and the amended filing came in at 8:12, she said. Naomi nodded. "And the parties from Cole versus Mercer?" Ms. Parker hesitated for half a heartbeat before answering. "Present and waiting, Your Honor." Ethan's steps faltered. Vanessa's head turned so sharply that a loose strand of hair slipped from behind her ear. Cole versus Mercer. Their case. Their hearing. The realization hit not with noise, but with that horrible, sinking quiet that comes when the world suddenly arranges itself into a shape you should have seen much sooner. They had not insulted a stranger in a courthouse garage. They had humiliated the judge assigned to hear their own emergency motion. Ethan felt heat crawl up the back of his neck despite the cool recycled air. Vanessa clutched her folder so tightly the edges bent beneath her fingers. For a moment neither of them spoke, because there are truths so humiliating they rob language before they rob pride. The courtroom doors opened. A bailiff announced the judge's arrival to the people already gathered inside. Chairs shifted. Papers stopped rustling. Conversations died. Naomi crossed the threshold with calm authority, and the room rose as one. Ethan and Vanessa stood too, but unlike everyone else, They were not standing out of custom. They were standing inside the consequence of what they had revealed about themselves when they thought no one important was watching. Judge Naomi Brooks took her seat without haste, set the leather case beside the bench, and looked out over the courtroom with the same composed stillness that had unsettled the garage. The room itself was a study in polished formality, dark wood, brass lamps, the state seal fixed above her like a promise too often spoken and too rarely kept. Morning light slipped through the high windows in pale strips, catching dust in the air and laying it softly across the council tables. To anyone entering fresh, it would have looked like order. But Naomi had spent enough years in rooms like this to know that order and fairness were not the same thing. Sometimes injustice came shouting. More often, it arrived in pressed suits, lowered voices, and people who were certain they would never be questioned. "Please be seated," she said. Her voice was calm, even warm if someone wanted to hear it that way, but there was a precision to it that tightened the room. Chairs moved. Papers shifted. The attorneys settled. Ethan and Vanessa Cole lowered themselves into their seats at the petitioner's table with the brittle stiffness of people trying not to be seen after becoming unforgettable for the worst reason. Naomi opened the case and withdrew the hearing packet Ms. Parker had mentioned. On top sat the emergency motion in Cole versus Mercer, a property dispute wrapped in polished language and urgent claims. A family trust. A contested transfer. Allegations of bad faith. Naomi had reviewed the file the night before, and again at dawn, because that was who she was. She did not walk into her courtroom unprepared. But now the paper carried a different weight. The names on the motion were no longer abstract. They belonged to the same two people who had stood in a garage and tried to decide who looked worthy of access. Across from them sat the respondent, Daniel Mercer, a graying man in his 60s with tired eyes and a county public interest attorney beside him. He looked worn down, the way people often do after months of being squeezed by those with more money than patience. Naomi noticed how he sat, careful and quiet, hands folded as if making himself smaller might protect him from being misunderstood. She noticed everything. She always did. The bailiff called the matter to order. An attorney for the Coles rose first, a polished man with an expensive watch and a voice trained to sound reasonable while asking for things that were not. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward request for immediate possession and injunctive relief." Straightforward. Another useful American word. It often meant, "Please do not look too closely." Naomi listened without interruption, one hand resting lightly near the file, the other making a single note in the margin. Her face gave away nothing. Ethan stared at the tabletop. Vanessa kept her chin lifted, but her eyes were different now, stripped of that earlier certainty. Shame had not made her gentler. It had only made her quieter. The attorney continued, citing timelines and title records, trying to frame the hearing as a matter of delay and inconvenience. Then Daniel Mercer's counsel stood, and the tone of the room changed. There were questions about signatures, concerns about pressure placed on an elderly relative, missing disclosures, a rushed transfer pushed through while a family member was in assisted care. Naomi asked only a few questions, but each one landed exactly where the polished story began to crack. Dates, witnesses, authorization, who was present, who benefited. Ethan finally looked up at that, just for a second, and met Naomi's eyes. He looked away almost instantly. It was not fear exactly. It was the dawning recognition that the woman he had dismissed in a garage was not merely the judge on his case. She was also someone who could see through performance with frightening speed. Naomi turned one page in the packet and paused. There, clipped near the back, was a supplemental affidavit filed at 8:12 that morning. The witness attached to it was a building attendant from the Mercer property, someone who had seen more than the original motion admitted. Naomi read in silence for a moment while the courtroom waited. The stillness stretched. Then she lifted her eyes toward counsel. "It appears," she said softly, "that this matter is not as straightforward as it was presented to the court." And just like that, the hearing they thought would be routine began to slip away from them. The attorney for the Coles tried to recover first. Men like him always did. He adjusted his cuff, lifted his chin, and stepped back into the polished rhythm of argument as if confidence alone could restore the version of events that had started slipping from his hands. "Your Honor, with respect, the affidavit does not change the urgency before the court. My clients have acted within their rights, and any suggestion otherwise is speculative at best." Naomi Brooks looked down at the page again, then back up, her expression unreadable. Speculative, she repeated, not as agreement, but as examination. The words settled over the room like a stone dropped in still water. She turned one more page in the packet, then rested her fingertips lightly against the bench. Counsel, your motion describes a lawful transfer, immediate risk of property loss, and a need for emergency relief. The supplemental affidavit suggests your clients entered that property before the disputed transfer was fully resolved, removed documents from a locked office, and instructed staff not to contact Mr. Mercer's daughter. The attorney's face did not fall, not quite, but something in it tightened. Ethan's shoulders drew up. Vanessa stared straight ahead, jaw rigid, as if dignity could be rebuilt through posture alone. Across the aisle, Daniel Mercer looked down at his folded hands, the years visible in them. Naomi noticed that too. There was no performance in him, no expensive calm, just exhaustion. The kind that comes from being cornered politely for a very long time. Your Honor, the attorney said again, the affiant is a maintenance worker, not a legal witness to title. Naomi gave the slightest nod, and yet he appears to be a direct witness to conduct. Silence followed that. Clean, sharp, the kind of silence that forces truth into better focus. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. There was nothing dramatic in the movement, nothing designed for effect, and still the room seemed to draw tighter around it. This court does not grant emergency relief simply because one side arrives first in a tailored suit and a rehearsed sense of urgency. A few people in the gallery shifted at that. Not loudly, just enough to register that the air had changed again. Ethan lifted his eyes in spite of himself, and for the first time since the garage he did not look confused. He looked cornered by recognition. He understood now that Judge Brooks was not merely hearing the case. She was hearing him, not his title, not his money, not the confidence he wore like armor. Him. Naomi turned toward the respondent's counsel. Mr. Mercer's daughter was not notified of the transfer meeting? No, Your Honor, the attorney answered. And the family caregiver who had power of medical communication was excluded? Yes, Your Honor. Naomi made another note. The scratch of her pen sounded louder than it should have in the stillness. And the signatures on the revised trust documents were executed 48 hours after Mr. Mercer entered assisted living? That is correct. Vanessa finally spoke, unable to contain herself any longer. That is not what happened. Her voice came out too fast, too sharp, startling even her own attorney. Naomi's eyes lifted to her at once, and the courtroom seemed to stop breathing. Mrs. Cole, she said, calm and level, your counsel will speak for you unless I direct otherwise. Vanessa swallowed and sat back, color rising in her face. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not glare. She did not need to. There is a particular kind of authority that does not announce itself because it has already been earned, and Naomi carried that authority the way some people carry scars, quietly, permanently, without asking anyone to notice. The attorney for the Coles tried one more time. Your Honor, whatever misunderstanding occurred this morning or in the hallway should not influence the legal standard before the court. He regretted the sentence the moment it left his mouth. Naomi's gaze sharpened by the smallest degree. Counsel, she said, I have not referenced this morning. The courtroom went so still that even the reporter in the second row stopped typing. The attorney looked down at his papers. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. Vanessa turned pale, because now the truth had deepened. It was not only that they had disrespected the judge, it was that their own side had just confirmed, in open court, that something had happened worth hiding. Naomi folded her hands. What influences this court, she said, is credibility. And credibility, once exposed, is difficult to restore. The courtroom stayed silent after that, but it was no longer the silence of routine. It was the silence that comes when everyone in the room realizes they are no longer watching a standard hearing, but the slow exposure of something uglier than a property dispute. Judge Naomi Brooks let that silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Not to punish, not to perform, but because truth, when it finally enters a room, deserves space to be heard. She opened the file once more and turned to the clerk. Ms. Parker, please mark the supplemental affidavit as received and note for the record that the court has concerns regarding the completeness of the petitioner's emergency filings. Yes, Your Honor, Ms. Parker replied, her voice steady now, though a trace of the morning still lingered in her eyes. Naomi looked toward counsel for the Coles. This court is denying the request for immediate possession at this time. The words fell with quiet finality. Ethan's head came up. Vanessa inhaled sharply beside him. Their attorney stood frozen for half a beat, already calculating how to object without sounding desperate. Naomi continued before he could speak. The emergency nature of this petition was presented as if delay would cause irreparable harm. What I see instead are unresolved questions of notice, authority, access to records, and the timing of critical signatures involving an elderly party under care. This court will not reward haste when haste appears to have been used as a substitute for transparency. On the respondent's side of the courtroom, Daniel Mercer closed his eyes briefly, not in victory, but in relief. It was the kind of relief that does not celebrate. It simply exhales after carrying too much for too long. Naomi saw that too. She always saw the people who had spent months being overlooked by those who spoke the loudest. The attorney for the Coles finally cleared his throat. Your Honor, we would request a continuance of no more than 72 hours to supplement the record. Naomi folded her hands. You may file a revised motion through proper channels. You may also provide full notice to all interested family parties, including those previously excluded. In addition, this court is directing that the trust documents at issue be submitted for independent review of execution timing and witness procedure. The attorney nodded stiffly. There was no room left for charm. No space left for polished shortcuts. Naomi then turned her attention, not to the merits of the motion, but to the standards of the courtroom itself. Her gaze settled first on the bailiff, then on the clerk, then finally on the attorneys before returning to the parties. There is something else that needs to be said, she said, her voice still even, though it carried farther now. No one moved. A courthouse is not simply a building where disputes are filed. It is a public trust. People enter these walls carrying grief, fear, confusion, and sometimes the last hope they have left. No one should have to prove they belong here before they are treated with basic respect. Ethan stared at the table. Vanessa did not. She sat rigid, pale, eyes fixed on Naomi as if she were hearing a language she had never been forced to understand before. Naomi did not name the garage. She did not need to. The message found its target without assistance. Status, clothing, accent, skin color, and assumption. Naomi continued. None of these are credentials for deciding who deserves dignity in a place governed by law. The reporter in the second row resumed typing, but softly now, almost reverently, as if she understood. This part mattered more than the ruling itself. Naomi's eyes shifted toward the back of the room, where the court security officer from the garage had quietly taken position near the door, hoping perhaps to disappear into professional stillness. He could not. The court also expects its officers and staff to begin from fairness, not from presumption, she said. The officer lowered his gaze. It was not humiliation for its own sake. It was accountability in its proper form, precise, public, and impossible to misunderstand. Naomi picked up her pen and signed the order denying emergency relief pending full review. Then she set the pen down with the softest click. This matter will be reset upon proper filing. Until then, no party is to alter access to the Mercer residence, remove records, or interfere with family communication concerning care decisions. Is that understood? Yes, Your Honor, came the answer from both tables, though one side sounded grateful and the other sounded hollow. Naomi rose, and the room rose with her. But Ethan and Vanessa stood differently than before, not merely because custom required it. Because for the first time that morning, they understood what authority actually looked like when it was joined to integrity. And it looked nothing like them. When Judge Naomi Brooks stepped through the door behind the bench, the courtroom remained standing for a breath longer than usual, as if the room itself had not fully caught up to what had just happened. Then the side door closed softly. The seal above the bench stood unmoving in the quiet. An ordinary sound began to return in careful pieces. Chairs shifted. Papers gathered. Low voices rose and fell. But nothing felt ordinary to Ethan and Vanessa Cole. They stayed at their table a moment too long, their attorney murmuring something about next steps, supplemental filings, and preserving options, words polished enough to sound useful, but too thin to carry the weight now sitting on their shoulders. Vanessa nodded without hearing him. Ethan stared at the signed order as if the ink itself had judged him. Across the aisle, Daniel Mercer rose slowly, one hand pressing against the edge of the table for support. His attorney touched his elbow and said something gentle that did not carry across the room. And for the first time all morning, the older man allowed himself a look toward the bench, not triumphant, not bitter, just grateful in the tired, human way people look when someone in power finally decides to see them clearly. Ethan noticed that look, and something in him turned. Not outward, inward. That was the worst part of mornings like this. The consequence was not only public embarrassment. It was private recognition. The moment a man realized the language he had used to sort other people had finally sorted him instead. By the time the hallway outside filled again, word had already started to travel the way courthouse stories always do. Not loudly, not with gossip exactly, but through lowered voices and glances that lingered half a second too long. Ms. Parker moved briskly between chambers and the clerk's office, carrying folders and maintaining her professionalism, but she did not need to explain anything. Deputy Ruiz did not ask questions either. She simply watched Ethan and Vanessa exit courtroom 4C with the calm, unreadable face of someone who had worked long enough in public institutions to know that character often reveals itself before credentials ever do. Near the far wall, the court security officer from the garage stood unusually straight, his coffee long gone cold on a side counter, his expression quieter than before. He stepped toward Ethan and Vanessa as if to offer direction, then thought better of it. There are some walks people need to make without help. The elevator ride down felt smaller than the one up, though nothing about the dimensions had changed. Vanessa kept her arms folded tightly across her body, her folder held like a shield that could no longer protect her from herself. Ethan stood beside her with his hands at his sides, no longer adjusting his tie, no longer performing confidence. When the doors opened to the parking level, the same pale lights buzzed overhead. The same concrete waited. The same lane between the columns stretched back toward the place where they had first seen Naomi and decided they already knew who she was. But space has memory. So do buildings. So do mornings. Vanessa stopped walking. "We were trying to help," she said, though even she seemed to know the sentence sounded weak before it finished. Ethan shook his head once. "No," he said, his voice lower than it had been all day. "We were trying to feel bigger." It was the most honest thing he had said since sunrise. Vanessa looked at him then, really looked at him, and whatever defense had remained in her face gave way to something harder to name. Not innocence. Not even remorse in its cleanest form. Just the first painful edge of understanding. Somewhere above them, another courtroom door opened. Another case began. Another group of strangers stepped into the machinery of law, hoping someone inside would treat them like they belonged to the same country as everyone else. Ethan and Vanessa stood in silence for another moment before moving toward their car, smaller now somehow, diminished not by punishment alone, but by revelation. They had entered that courthouse believing authority belonged to the loudest voice, the boldest assumption, the widest comfort. They left it having learned something colder and far more permanent. Real authority does not need to announce itself in a garage. Real dignity does not beg to be recognized. And justice, when it finally lifts its eyes, has a long memory. Because he thought power meant deciding who belonged in the room. But that morning, the room belonged to the woman he tried to deny.